So, welcome to Cinema Convos. This is the show where we bring guests with different tastes in film. I'm your host, Yash. I'm here with our special guest, Tim. And today we are discussing the film 2001 A Space Odyssey from 1968, which was directed by Stanley Kubrick. Before we get started today, just wanted to issue a quick spoiler warning. We will get into the plot points, and we would recommend checking out the movie before listening to this episode. And with that, Tim, my first question for you today is, what's your first memory or best memory with this movie?
All right, so I'll take that question from the best memory perspective. Back in 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the film 2001 A Space Odyssey. And so I went to see that film with my girlfriend in IMAX, 70 millimeter projection, and or the film was, 70 millimeter. And it was just a tantalizing, amazing experience where the IMAX audio is really shaking the seats, because 2001 is a film that is very nonverbal and very based in sound and music. And so having the sound systems in an IMAX theater made that quite amazing. And then just seeing my girlfriend get to experience the awe and intrigue of the film was quite cool, because the film really does deviate from a lot of other movies in the way it presents narratives and stories. So it was cool to be party to somebody else experiencing that for the first time.
Yeah, for sure. I have not seen the movie in IMAX, but I do remember when that re-release came around. And the movie was always something I'd heard of, but it kind of got back on my radar around that time. I've only seen this movie once, and it was this year, like in May. And yeah, I mean, it was something to say the least. But an interesting memory I have with this movie is when I was back at A&M for MSc IE Cinema, we had this movie as one of our screenings from the classics team. Yes, shout out IE Cinema if you're listening to this.
Woo! I should say.
Yeah, and I remember I didn't watch it at the screening because I was busy running it. I didn't want to sit for 3 hours in case something happened during that time. But I remember like a group of us were sitting outside, and I could just see firsthand the divisive nature of this movie, because I saw one of my friends who was like, yeah, this movie's awesome, it's so incredible, and one person was like, I turned it off after 20 minutes. So it's just the general divisive nature of the movie fascinated me, and what led me to watch it was just I'd seen a few of Kubrick's other films, and I saw a good Blu-ray like package bundle with like A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and 2001. Yeah. And I was at the point where I was like, well, I already like The Shining, so I might as well buy this and check out the other two. And so I watched 2001. Admittedly, did not watch it in one sitting. It was a little draining for that. But yeah, I mean, overall, I can see why this movie is so influential, and obviously, like, for the time it was made in, like, the visual effects are incredible.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to kind of piggyback off that really briefly and say that when this film was premiered, it was received very divisively in the showing itself. So this screenplay was by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, a sci-fi author and engineer in his own right. They were at the showing, and I think Arthur Clarke was in tears at one point because people were walking out of the film and Kubrick was pacing. Though in the original screening, there was a lot more runtime dedicated to the beginning of the film that was cut for the final theatrical release. So even from its inception in the premiere, the New York premiere at least, it was quite divisive, and the audience did not know how to really take the film. And I think that is probably true to this day. A lot of people don't, take this film well necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, when I watch this movie, one thing I personally believe is that this is not particularly a movie you watch for entertainment. It's a movie, it kind of challenges the viewer just to like take in a lot of visual and, as you said, like sound elements all at once. So bouncing off all of this, I wanted to ask you, what are some of your personal favorite aspects of the movie?
Gosh. So I think some of the things that resonate the most with me in this movie are the themes and just the way that they're presented so masterfully by Stanley Kubrick, who is such a perfectionist. He very much frustrated the crew of this film because he would do so many repeated shots, so many edits, especially down to the wire. He was cutting this film like days before its theatrical release. So some of the aspects that resonate to me, like I said, are thematic. And I would kind of, if I had to pinpoint the theme of the movie, it's really about humanity's relationship with technology and the universe at large, be it from an existential perspective or whatever, but the evolution of man is very interesting. And that's something that speaks a lot to me. Even back in college at A&M, I had astronomy classes for my science classes.
Mm-hmm.
I also had a class in Big Bang and black holes.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been very fascinated with space, with philosophy as well. And so this film is just a big philosophical statement, and it begs a lot of questions about our existence and like the direction that we're going as a society, which I would hope would be that we would be spacefaring. And so that's what really resonates with me, is that there's just this evolution of man. And that was also very much in Stanley Kubrick's mind when he developed the film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the movie definitely tackles a lot of big ideas, and it is one of those movies that I feel like on the surface has more questions than answers, which is okay.
Yes.
Because I remember after watching this movie, I kind of went down a rabbit hole of just interpretations of the ending and like different things on YouTube, because I truly did not know what to think of it. I was
Well,
just,
I'm curious, is like, what was your first impression when you like catch the last shot of the film and there's a
like
embryo, a fetal,
Yeah.
child hovering above Earth? What did you kind of take away when you
I
saw
mean,
that?
honestly, I genuinely had no idea, and I was trying to figure out if I had an interpretation of it, but again, I don't think it's a movie that's meant to be fully
Yeah,
understood. But I've
no,
heard, I mean, you may have more to speak about this, but I've heard knowing the context of the book helps a little bit.
a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, as you're saying, there is a book that accompanies the film. It was actually, they were written concurrently by Arthur C. Clarke, and the way it kind of got started was this author Arthur C. Clarke had a short story called The Sentinel that Kubrick took a liking to, and it was about some extraterrestrials that left objects, on the moon, and stuff that kind of made its way into the final cut of the film. But Kubrick was really intrigued with this idea of, extraterrestrials kind of leaving things behind. And so I guess broadly speaking, interpretively about the movie, there's certainly a lot of ways you can look at it. And the book elaborates on kind of how literal it is. And so the book gives you these details that I'll kind of provide you. 4 million years ago, a bunch of extraterrestrial beings left 4 different monoliths, which is kind of what the rectangular slab, they're called the monoliths, left 4 monoliths buried kind of around Earth's solar system. And progressively, humans discover them. At the beginning of the film, we've got the Dawn of Man sequence, where you have some early hominids, apes, upright. They kind of push out of their territory, and then they see this obelisk, and it drives them to find technology and use bones as weapons. And we've got a big leap forward millions of years to our next character and our next development in the film, which is on the moon. And there's another monolith they found on the moon. And then, beyond that, we see there's a monolith later in the film near Jupiter. And the final monolith that appears in the film appears in the human zoo hotel room of Dave Bowman at the end of the film. So the film really is broken down into the four sections signified by the different monoliths that we see, which represent different stages of human development.
That definitely that makes sense. I'm looking at it now. So we've talked a little bit about some of the visual elements of the movie. I was wondering if there's, as you said, like Stanley Kubrick was known for being a perfectionist in everything he did, and I've heard many cast and crew members in a lot of his films had hard time with him. But he was truly a visionary director, to say the least. And I haven't seen all of his films. I've seen a few of them, maybe like 4 or 5, and he always did challenge people intellectually, I think, in all of his films. And I was wondering if there was anything about his style that particularly stands out to you in this film.
Yeah, I mean, this film was the pioneer sci-fi film.
Mm-hmm.
Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick both kind of noted when they were going into this film, like, there's really not any great sci-fi out there. There was some good stuff about aliens with, you had wacky depictions, but really this film's dynamic approach was pioneering the genre of sci-fi that would inspire people like George Lucas or, Christopher Nolan when he made Interstellar. Or this film just really pioneers the sci-fi genre well, and it does so by probably presenting one of the most accurate depictions of space travel that we have kind of seen put to film. And Kubrick was very particular about making it look like, okay, everything's in a vacuum when we're in space, and when we're on our crafts, we've got to deal with gravity. And there was a lot of consideration put into that. I mean, he spent $750,000 out of his original $6 million budget building a carousel a
Hmm.
giant carousel set that would give the appearance of a rotating space platform.
Yeah,
So he really did so much to pioneer sci-fi efforts, things that would later be replicated with digital technology. But it's really a monument to the development of sci-fi as a genre, I would say.
for sure. Yeah, I mean this movie, whether you love it or hate it, you cannot deny that it has an influence on sci-fi because there's so many things that you through the decades see in many other films, like some of the ones you've mentioned. It's interesting you brought up Interstellar because I just watched that one again recently, and that's a movie I appreciated a lot more after a repeat viewing. And
Mm-hmm.
2001 is not a movie I'm gonna watch again like too often, but it is a movie that I'm intrigued to like look more into and just like
Yeah.
it piques my interest into like seeing different people's interpretations of things and
It's
what.
definitely something that benefits from a second viewing, like
Mhm.
significantly, I would say.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, if it ever released in IMAX, I might be willing to check it out. I mean, it'd be kind of cool
Yeah,
to
it's
see.
definitely worth viewing more or less how Kubrick intended it to be viewed,
Right.
on the 70 millimeter projection.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I know we've mentioned some other films that were inspired by this movie, but are there any movies that are similar to this that you'd like to discuss further or kind of relate to 2001?
I think a few other sci-fi films are Kubrickian in scale. Maybe recently Ad Astra you've seen, but
Mm-hmm.
what really comes to mind is Interstellar, the Christopher Nolan film with Matthew McConaughey, which was personally just brilliant, and it really captures the scale and the movement of space. There's some criticisms I would level against that film narratively, but it's another film that's just beautiful and deals with space. And I previously mentioned Kubrick had a set piece in the 2001 film of a rotating carousel, and that's very reminiscent of some of the practical set pieces Christopher Nolan would employ, like in Inception. People might have seen the rotating hallway sequence is
Right.
actually a mechanical, practical set piece that rotated. It was a giant hallway rotating. It took its idea from the
Yeah,
rotating,
I think Christopher Nolan
platform.
is definitely not to compare the two, but almost like one of the visionaries of our time, kind of like Stanley Kubrick was for his time.
Definitely.
He just innovates different genres, and again, if the visual effect can be created with like practical tools, then he will choose to go that route,
Yeah.
which I think they're similar in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Interstellar is personally a film that I like more than this one. But again, they're
Yeah.
so different. It's hard to really compare the two. There's more of a dramatic, character-driven story
I
and
have another interesting comparison that
sure,
I've
sure.
been kind of cogitating on, and that would be to The Mandalorian.
Okay.
Are you familiar with how The Mandalorian was filmed from like a special effects perspective, not using green screens?
Actually, no, but I'm caught up though. So there's
Yeah,
that.
good. It's excellent. So yeah, they opted Favreau opted not to use green screen tech in The Mandalorian in favor of having like backlit LED screens that use the I think Unity 3D or perhaps whatever Epic Games and video game engine is
Mhm.
to track camera movement and create dynamic real lighting to avoid issues with green screen that happen like splash because green reflects on metallic surfaces a lot and there's a lot of post production that does to go with that. And so Kubrick had a lot of stuff in the film that was he didn't have any chroma keying that is green screen and blue screen. It was all like projected backgrounds and stuff like that. When you had like human sequences, like in the beginning of the film, rather with the Dawn of Man, a lot of those backgrounds were projected. And I think The Mandalorian is another modern thing that kind of tries to take the approach to sets in a way that makes them appear a little bit more real through a more practical approach.
Yeah, for sure. That I didn't know that. That's really cool. Um, but yeah, I mean, again, like this movie, it has visual effects that are really impressive. Especially, I mean, they're impressive for the '60s, but they're impressive now. Like that's the most amazing thing about
Yeah.
it. I think is that how real everything looks while watching it. Because
And
a
I
lot of
think it's the realism that really scared people.
yeah,
And this is a product of the fact that Kubrick consulted a lot of NASA engineers, former NASA employees, and a lot of other companies like IBM when it came to developing HAL 9000. He consulted a lot of companies and created a very realistic depiction of what space would look like. And so, come a year later, in 1969, when we do make the moon landing, people are convinced that it's just some people to this day that Kubrick just directed this and that the space landing's fake. And,
Yeah.
I saw 2001 The Space Odyssey last year, and this is, looks exactly like if 2001 Space Odyssey almost looks more real in a lot of respects than, the moon landing
Yeah, it's really,
looked. And
really
that's kind of a relic of, obviously, cameras recording on a celestial body, thousands of miles away from Earth.
for sure.
But it led to a lot of skepticism about the moon landing, how realistic this film depicted space travel.
Yeah, I mean, if you're one of those people that believes the moon landing was faked, this is a solid piece of evidence, I would say.
Yeah, and would you, so you saw the sequences in the film where they're on the moon, and besides not properly maybe acting in accordance to the moon's gravity, it
Yeah.
looks quite a lot like the Apollo footage. Albeit I'm obviously a full believer that mankind did touch the moon. You can prove
I
that,
am too.
but of course, get that out the air.
Yeah, neither of us are non-believers in that regard.
Right. I have met some flat earthers in my time, but and moon landing conspiracy theorists, but that's something you could prove in your own backyard with a telescope. So yeah,
True.
and that's a lot of actually what Arthur C. Clarke and other scientists really exposed Kubrick to. A lot of the impetus to this film was there's a New York World's Fair, like 64, 65, and there were a lot of really cool exhibits at the World's Fair about science, technology, and the whole theme was kind of like humanity's next era. And a lot of that really drove Kubrick to seriously consider these kind of themes of technology and space exploration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this movie has as you mentioned earlier, it is almost told in like 4 different parts, right? And
Yes.
I was wondering if you had like a favorite sequence or a favorite scene in the movie that just stands out to you.
My favorite sequence in the film is Hal's deactivation sequence.
Mm-hmm.
What's really curious about the characters in the film is all the human characters are, funny enough, far more robotic than the AI character, which is Hal 9000.
Mm-hmm.
And Hal, he presents a very interesting element in the film, because you can see from almost his first appearance on screen that Hal has sentience and he understands more about the world than he lets on. And I really just love the sequence in the film after Hal has, quite frankly, murdered all of the astronauts besides Dr. David Bowman. When Bowman has to enter back into the Discovery 1 spacecraft through the airlock and makes his way to the room where Hal's memory is kind of stored and has to pull it. And Hal is singing the nursery kind of rhyme song, Daisy, Daisy. And it's kind of slowing down. I know the voice actor apparently had to record 51 or something like that, different takes of singing Daisy, Daisy at different off-tempo, off-pitch levels for Kubrick to string that together to make what we finally get is Hal 9000's death. I think there's a lot of cool ethical things that kind of come into that about AI is, what is it like to kill, quote unquote, in AI at this level? It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
My instructor was Mr. Langley, and he taught me to sing a song. If you'd like to hear it, I can sing it for you.
Yes, I'd like to hear it, Hal. Sing it for me.
It's called Daisy. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer, do.
Yeah, I would say I don't know if I have a favorite sequence because I've only seen the movie once. I did like the character of Hal 9000. I thought that was, very fascinating. It is what I'd heard the most about this film beforehand. So I was looking forward to seeing how that sequence played out. But, as much as I don't really understand it, I really appreciate the ending of this movie, the last 20 minutes or so, just because that's what, that's what people like to discuss and talk about. And I think it's intriguing to see different people's takes on it.
Yeah, a lot of this film focuses on aging and like a lot of fetal imagery. And the way I'll kind of discuss this is look at the dawn of man.
Yeah.
And you see these man apes mostly on, walking on their hands, except for at the beginning of the film, you've got Moonwatcher, who is our ape man, who is a little bit smarter, a little bit above the rest of his apes. And he is the one who discovers the initially touches the obelisk, the monolith, and gains sentience. And that is the, so to speak, birth of the modern man, insofar as we figured out we can use weapons, tools as weapons, interchangeably, whatever. And then we flash forward into the future, and there's a lot of implications in this film that Kubrick avoided directly because he had recently come off of Dr. Strangelove, which very literally deals with nuclear weapons. But there's a lot of implications that some of these space craft probably are weapons platforms in the film, and it's another stage of our evolution, our birth, our whatever. You'll have that we move beyond the moon. We figure out, oh, there's something at Jupiter. Extraterrestrials must have put this here. You get to the final sequence of the film, and some people have described the Stargate sequence, which is where you've got the flashing lights, as almost a birth canal for the eventual star child that we see at the end of the film. And so interpretively, I think the way I kind of take the ending of the film, which is you have a baby floating in space that is slowly turning towards the camera and looks at you directly at the viewer in an almost knowing way. And the way I've always seen the film since my first viewing is that this is a film about human evolution, and that we've progressed to the next stage, which is maybe the star child, which may or may not be completely metaphorical. And Dr. David Bowman's probably just, as a result of whether the extraterrestrial involvement, has ascended to the next stage of human evolution, which Friedrich Nietzsche would have described as Übermensch, which is obviously a philosophy that Hitler took over in awful ways. But the beginning of this film features the music to Also Sprach Zarathustra, which is a tonal poem by Richard Strauss, who is looking at the Friedrich Nietzsche work. It's all about the death of God and the evolution of humanity, and that the goal is to have this Übermensch. And so the film 2001: A Space Odyssey is a movie that is suggesting throughout its duration that humanity has room to evolve. And I think Kubrick's expressed that to him, the final sequence is more of like our spiritual energy. We've transcended technology, and humanity is now an entity that could traverse the cosmos more as a thought than as a physical, entity, so to speak.
Just a very, very perplexing and interesting scene to dig into.
Yeah. I can also speak to some of the trippiness of the film.
Yeah, this movie is I watched a review saying this film is very hypnotic, and I think that's a good word to describe it. Regardless of how slow it gets at times, you're always just kind of awe-inspired by it. You're always interested to see what you'll see next.
That was the goal. It was not, the idea was not that you're going to be hooked by the, titillizing dialogue. A lot of the dialogue in the movie is super pedestrian. Like, how are you doing today? Oh, I don't know. Kind of, it's very pedestrian, and it's meant to magnify, the other aspects of the film, which are meant to indeed inspire awe and wonder. You've got a long sequence near the beginning of the film where a space shuttle is docking on this rotating platform, and it's set to a brilliant classical piece, the Blue Danube, and it's this brilliant piece. It's slow, and it really makes you sit back, definitely in contrast to other films, and think about, wow, like humanity is really freaking cool, that this is something that we can aspire to.
That one moment with the Blue Danube is really impressive in my opinion, because it is a slower piece, but it captures like the feeling of the scene very well, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's a waltz.
Right.
And so, in the same way, the space shuttle and the space platform are dancing, and they're performing a waltz, so they've got to get in sync and perform the docking. It was very intentional. Now, funny enough, the film originally had a score, and it was composed. There was a composer working on the film, and Kubrick kind of threw that out. He just tossed on, Also Sprach Zarathustra and Blue Danube and a couple other pieces here and there. He found that to be more compelling than the score. And the guy who wrote the score didn't find this out until the premiere.
Yikes.
So he's in the film, like movie watches, like none of this is my music.
Yeah, it's interesting because you kind of know, like within the first 20 minutes or so, if this movie is going to be something you're interested in watching or not, because it literally opens with a black screen and just music, which
Yeah, for probably 2 minutes. Yeah.
was all like I had to make sure the movie wasn't paused or something before I like watched it.
Yeah, or there's not something wrong with my video. Like I'm getting the audio, but not the video. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like there's nothing wrong with that, but it's like it's very intentionally slow paced, which is
Yeah.
for what it sets out to do. It is meant to, make you think and kind of just take it all in for the 2.5 hours it goes for. But yeah, I would not go into this movie expecting like a typical like science fiction like action movie or something.
Right.
But yeah, it's it's a movie. As soon as I finished it, I didn't really know if I liked it or not, and I was trying to make my mind up about it. I kind of slept on it before I like wrote a review or anything, and my consensus was that I liked it. I didn't love it, but I can definitely appreciate a lot of the things it did for science fiction, and I guess just cinema in general.
Well, Arthur C. Clarke even kind of said that
Yeah.
the co-author of this, Kubrick pushed back against it. He said, if you don't understand this film on the first viewing,
Mhm.
you're good. We've done our job. If you think you understand it, then we kind of messed up.
Yeah.
Kubrick kind of pushed back against that. He kind of said, no, he thinks that the awe that this film inspires is something you get on the first viewing.
Mm.
But there is certainly a level of like, how do I interpret this film? How do I even take it?
Yeah.
Because it is such a different, even from other Kubrick films, like I've mentioned Dr. Strangelove, like you've mentioned A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, which are at least, or Full Metal Jacket, they're all more narratively and character driven than this film. So it's very much an intentional entry into Kubrick's film, registry, and his really his magnum opus, I would say, because he really denies anything that is easy in film,
Right.
which is like character development and narrative. Not that that's easy, but he really just said, hey, let's just make a film that's very nonverbal, and let's see how much we can communicate to the audience. And obviously, from the division that he's created, he definitely communicated mystery and ambiguity.
For sure. I mean, he in the films I've seen from him, I mean, he did try to create movies that are different, whether they're following a specific genre. They still stand out. Like Full Metal Jacket is I would say one of the best movies about the Vietnam War, in my opinion, at least.
It's very human. Yeah.
Because of the way it's told. And I've seen some other movies, about the same subject matter, like Platoon, or I'm drawing a blank here, but there's definitely a few more. And I just think he tries to tell a story, but he also tries to challenge the viewer with, moral questions and, just different things that force you to think deeper to fully appreciate the movie.
And on a brief comment on Full Metal Jacket, the way that Private Pile is developed, I mean, it really does seek to the way that Kubrick developed that really forces you to question things. And in that case, it really was a lot about the Vietnam War, naturally. But Kubrick, he designs his films so that you leave asking questions, and you leave having thought deeper about a subject than you perhaps have in the past.
Right. Because I remember around when I saw this film, I saw A Clockwork Orange, which many people had told me was, very disturbing, and it's a great movie, but don't watch it casually. And it was very disturbing, but it's a movie that discusses topics such as like what makes us human and the idea of choice and different things like that. And I think that was really fascinating to watch. So I think in general, all the movies I've seen from him have some kind of moral component, which is very fascinating to me. And I think it opens a lot of opportunities for discussion, which is really cool, I think.
Yeah. Jumping off that, there's a really cool like Nietzsche-based interpretation of 2001: A Space Odyssey that relates a lot to A Clockwork Orange as well, which for your listeners is, trigger warning, a disturbing film.
Yeah, it's messed up.
Very disturbing film. Also includes a lot of interesting use of classical music.
Yeah. I was Singing in the Rain recently too, and I couldn't watch it normally because of
after seeing it. Yeah, I could see that. Sing it. Yes, it's very significant in the Clockwork Orange. So there's this whole thought kind of coming out about, or that has long come out about these films and stuff, that Kubrick definitely intended. It's very Apollonian and Dionysian, to speak to the Greek, gods Dionysius and Apollo. And you see in A Clockwork Orange, in Alex, a very Dionysian character, one that's driven by his whim and and passion, and he's violent. That's very what we call in literature and this kind of analysis Dionysian. And you see that in 2001: A Space Odyssey as well, with these these primeval men smashing things with bones. They're very Dionysian. But you get somebody like Dr. Dave in the film, Bowman, who is very Apollonian, much more logical, reasonable and rational, and this is how we should look at things. And it takes kind of Hal's act of moral ambiguity and conflict, internal conflict, to kind of progress that, when Hal probably does something that you would not expect from a logical, reasonable machine, because Hal was stuck in a very confusing place for its programming.
Yeah, for sure.
I know this. I can bring it down for being less heady and cerebral as well. If you want it to be more,
you can talk about whatever you feel like.
Maybe I'm losing people with Dionysian and Apollonian.
I honestly, I think people who want to hear about this movie will be fascinated. So
good. So I was gonna say, I do still have things to say about like the trippy aspects of the film, because part of the marketing later kind of became like the ultimate trip, and there's an interesting like countercultural 60s 70s tie-in to this film, where like we can or cannot go with this on the podcast, but a lot of people went to this film like under the influence, like intentionally. And some of the advisors on this film were very fascinated in some of Timothy Leary's research at Harvard.
Yeah.
With this is getting some Joe Rogan territory here for you. So this is just me telling you before we maybe do or do not do this. But yeah, so Timothy Leary had this study he did at Harvard, where he had a lot of divinity, theology students.
Yeah.
Take psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms, of course, and see if it would help induce religious quote unquote experiences. And the results of this experiment, which were that yes, like people under the influence of psychedelics did experience religious experiences, that was very of note to some of the consultants on this film, that really drove the Stargate sequence to be as visually trippy as it was, probably understanding that there were going to be people who went to see this film, especially in the 60s and 70s, under the influence.
I mean, yeah, I can see that happening for sure. It definitely makes sense with someone this movie. But yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up, because I actually didn't know this until recently, but have you seen the film 2010? That's the sequel of the
I've avoided it like the plague.
Okay, because I'm curious what you've heard about it though, because I didn't even know there was a sequel. Like,
I don't know if I could like talk at length about the sequel. I just know that it was built upon Arthur C. Clarke wrote a few more novels that kind of expanded upon the ending and beginnings and gave you more lucidity about the film. And of course, one of these was adapted into what became 2010, which is a film that, from my understanding, was not critically received very well.
Yeah, it's pretty.
And Kubrick, obviously, in this case, he distanced himself from that.
Yeah.
That film. Yeah.
I didn't even realize there was like a movie. I thought because this movie doesn't need more particularly. Like, I guess it's like ambiguous enough, and there's enough sense of closure at the same time for me.
Ambiguity was kind of the key points. They were actually talking to Carl Sagan when they made this film, and that broke away when Carl Sagan wanted like 0.002% of money for every minute his like likeness was used in the film, because originally the film included like a prologue documentary. But when Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick were going into making this film, they fully intended upon using actual aliens in some form. Like, how do we represent these extraterrestrials? And it was Carl Sagan who offered the sage advice: don't show the aliens. Instead, leave shadows or traces of their existence, which kind of came to form in The Monolith, which was inspired from Arthur C. Clarke's novels anyways. but they decided to not physically show any extraterrestrials and instead heavily imply them. And this is a film that works a lot in the negative space of thought and presentation through its silence, but it's very much implying something that you don't see there. So like I said, it's the negative space, that there are clearly extraterrestrials involved in this film, yet you do not see them a single time.
What's interesting about that concept is it reminds me a lot of the original Alien, how they don't really show you the alien for a long time, and that for that movie's goal, it works because it tries to scare you and feel like claustrophobic, and then just the intensity of it. Obviously 2001 doesn't have those exact same goals, but it's interesting how in movies sometimes the less you see, the more effective it is, right?
Oh yeah, and I think this is a film that's a masterclass in that. I could go to town on criticizing movies that are very overly expository. They just
Right.
like lay their exposition to 2001 does not do that. They don't sit there talking about, this is the exact purpose we're on the moon. A lot of films will go through this kind of rigmarole to explain the audience what the plot is in a way that wouldn't be organic in real dialogue or conversation. And so 2001, as well as Alien, definitely capitalize on creating dramatic tension through the implication rather than exposing more or less, they're the elements of the film. And Sigourney Weaver played that incredibly well as well. I think that's one of the things that really drives that movie home more than 2001 is her acting.
For sure. Yeah, but in 2001, as we've already said, a lot of the dialogue feels more, I guess, more natural, and like there's not much of like nothing is trying to push a storyline. It's just it adds to this feeling of this feels real, and I think that's a really cool experience to have.
There's one really cool moment of human dialogue that I do appreciate in 2001, and it comes prior to the Jupiter section when we're on the moon with Dr. Haywood Floyd, or so when he's arriving at the base, and he meets some other Russian like diplomat bureaucratic people. You can see that Dr. Haywood Floyd, he's clearly some senior NASA or space executive or whatever, and he's kind of getting questioned by this Dr. Andrei Smiloslav guy about, well, we've heard something's going on at the American moon base in Tycho, and we think it's, what I've heard from my intelligence is that it's this whole outbreak of some alien disease or whatever, clearly kind of leading on Dr. Floyd to try and divulge something about the American mission that wasn't something he could divulge. And I think that's a really good echo of some of the like Cold War era influence on this film. It's very clear is any of the Soviet kind of cosmonaut or bureaucratic people that kind of appear in this film are clear echoes of the Cold War kind of is influence on the film.
Yeah, for sure.
Quite frankly, we have had some very reliable intelligence reports that quite a serious epidemic has broken out at Clarius. Something apparently of an unknown origin. This is in fact what has happened.
Sorry, Dr. Smyslov, but I'm really not at liberty to discuss this.
But this epidemic could quite easily spread to our base. We should be given all the facts, Dr. Floyd.
Yes, I know. As I said, I'm not at liberty to discuss it.
There is one question I like to ask everyone on the show, which is kind of a difficult question. But is there anything in this movie that you think could have been done better? Or do you think it's perfect in what it sets out to do?
Broadly speaking, I would argue the film is perfect in what it sets out to do. Though I think there are some elements that make the film choppier than it needs to be. One sequence in the film that comes to mind is you have Dr. Haywood Floyd communicating with his daughter. It's her birthday. And whatever child actress they used for the sequence just was not timing things well. And maybe that's a reflection of how telecommunications technology works between Earth and the moon and all that. But you could kind of tell they probably struggled with this child actor and we're just like, all right, we're taking that take, you know? And then broadly, I think for the sake of longevity, the film could have benefited from more in-depth dialogue and a few more narrative clues
Yeah.
here and there, for the sake of posterity and people viewing this film being like, what's going on? But no, I mean, I really think that the intention with the film was for it to inspire awe and to be pretty broadly ambiguous, and I think it succeeds at that. And where people come away from not liking it, it's probably because it doesn't explain things other films would, but that's not necessarily an indictment of the film.
Right.
That was exactly what it was supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't see this as a perfect film in terms of just how much I enjoyed it, but I do, again, as I've said, I do appreciate a lot of the themes and the visual aspects. I do feel there is one segment towards the middle, I think, that is fairly slow paced, where he's just like making a repair or something in space.
Yeah.
And, that segment was a little bit tough to like get through at some points, but I do think this movie doesn't have the same goal as a lot of other movies. And I think because of that, I do appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, there are plenty of spots, like exactly the moment you're mentioning, where they're fixing something on their telecommunications line, or Hal has said something's broken,
Yeah.
and so they're checking it out. That really draws itself out. Which I think Kubrick would argue it's from tension's perspective, but I think me and you could probably rightly say that he milks a couple parts of this film probably longer than need to be milked, especially for our modern, fast-paced brains.
Right.
Like stuff like the beginning of the film, the Dawn of Man sequence is just very slow. Some of even the docking sequence, in time feels more and more too slow. But I think, it's sometimes it's interesting to see something that takes such a different approach to
I do think
movie.
It's a fascinating movie, regardless of, like, even if you don't like it, you can't deny that it's very ambitious in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it's incredibly an ambitious film, and that's kind of what they set out to do and why it was so painstaking. They went $4.5 million over budget. It's probably $25 million adjusted for modern inflation. So you can really see the painstaking efforts in every stroke of the film. Certainly they went into it. And Kubrick was very worried because a lot of his famous films come after 2001.
Right. Looking at filmography.
And he was really riding on the success of the comedy Dr. Strangelove, or How to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Yeah, the long title.
Yeah,
that's true. A lot of his really well-known films came after this one. So the 70s, 80s.
His reputation kind of hinged upon this film. I mean, cinema goers, especially at premiere night, like, you could not picture an antsier climate. Like, they knew that this director who did really well with Dr. Strangelove, he was doing something mysterious and wide scale. And there was so much press buzz surrounding the film that it's not surprising that when it actually premiered, people were very stunned about what they saw.
Right. So I wanted to ask you before we got to the end today, if there are any talking points you wish to discuss, or do you have any questions for me?
Well, I think I just mentioning some fun aspects of the film that connect to me personally. I would like to add on. When I was in middle school, I really got into visual effects. And I was using a lot of free trials of software, this and that,
this is a great
After Effects and
to help get you into that more, I feel like.
Right. No, it's certainly, this is a precursor to my interest in film on a deep level. I was really into the TV show Heroes. And I was trying to recreate a lot of Heroes special effects on my very super budget systems. And I came across, at this point, it's probably 5th or 6th grade. I hadn't seen 2001 yet, but I came across the sequence in the film where Dr. Haywood Floyd he's passed out on this ship, kind of going to space, and his pen is just floating. And it's a beautiful sequence of the film because it's set to Blue Danube. And I recreated that a little bit on my own by dangling a pen in front of my camera and painstakingly going frame by frame and editing out the thread. And it did not result in a smooth shot, but I was really into, like I said, visual effects, and it was cool trying to recreate that from the film. I think it was very neat.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's it's interesting to see how different films impact different people's interests. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Another like interesting aspect of the film I'd like to mention that tracks with its theme of human evolution and a lot of imagery that invokes the idea of birth and all of that. The film mentions birthdays a lot.
Mm.
It is it's Dr. Floyd's daughter's birthday. At one point in the film, you see at another point in the film that one of the other astronauts with Dr. Bowman, Frank Poole, he gets a call from his parents about his birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's another sequence in the film where a birthday is mentioned. And of course, you have the baby at the end. So there are also a few times in the dialogue where it's clear that it's pointing towards this theme that has to do with development and human maturation. And that is kind of signaled very subtly by some of the dialogue, or a lot of the dialogue in the film, revolving around birthdays.
It's interesting. I actually didn't. That's not a detail I noticed the first time around. So
yeah, look for it next time you watch.
Yeah.
Another really interesting aspect of the film I'd like to bring up is in the Dawn of Man sequence. They really worked hard to make those apes seem very ape-like. There's sequences of the film where you're thinking like, oh, obviously those aren't real primates, but they're the actors that are in those suits, are really good. They use a lot of mimes for that. And they like went and they watched, they were in zoos and stuff, and they were watching like primates interact and how they moved, and they sought to kind of reflect that in the way that they mimed their performances, because obviously they don't have any dialogue besides grunts.
Right.
So something that signals really pure acting, not even dialogue, it's just miming, looking like an ape, and it's pretty convincing, and so you look at their suits and their eyeballs, which are maybe don't age as well.
Right.
In the modern day where we've got Planet of the Apes and stuff, the modern
one of the
incarnations.
The few effects in this movie that don't age that well, but again, like you see the amount of commitment put into it, and it's the best they could do at the time, I would say. So
definitely, there was not computer generated imagery.
In terms of how they were acting, like it definitely felt like animals. So
yeah, and they used live animals on the set, and these are one of the few times where Kubrick just could not take that many shots. There's a sequence at the beginning of the film where a live leopard leaps upon some of our man apes at the beginning of the film, and it was a very well-trained leopard, but there was a lot of tension. Kubrick probably took 2 takes of the shot where a live leopard is jumping on one of his mimes in the ape suits, because it was just that tense and that scary.
Right.
And there's a lot of tapirs as well, those kind of South American, Southeast Asian as well, pig-like creatures at the beginning of the film that are live animals that were used on the set.
We've covered a lot of different topics, so I was wondering if there's anything else.
I have a connection to tie in a question I have for you that's not related to this film, but it's like news related that I think you might take benefit from. All right. So Yash, I've kind of known you for a long time.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting things when I met you and we were talking about film that struck me is you are a huge James Bond fan.
I am.
And I remember you telling me when we met at Aggie Fish Camp about your viewings of the James Bond franchise. And so recently, obviously, we've had Sean Connery pass away, and I wanted to know kind of how that hit you.
I mean, Sean Connery, it was sad because Sean Connery is the first James Bond, and in terms of the portrayal of the character, he's one of my favorites. But to be fair, he lived a long life, and I'm happy in that aspect.
When did you say you had to leave?
Immediately. Almost immediately.
But yeah, I mean, it's made me want to. I was just rewatching the Daniel Craig Bonds recently. Just patiently waiting for the new one whenever that comes out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember with Sean Connery, a film that stood out to me was Goldfinger, which came out not like around the same time as this film, actually, in the 60s. And I think that's to this day one of the best Bond films. So I think that's probably his best Bond movie and one of my favorites as well.
Yeah, Goldfinger was just years before this film, and I think what you see in that film as well as this film is the hints, and it's just any film you really cut from the 60s has some like Cold War
Yeah,
elements that really underpin the film.
for sure. But yeah, it was sad news, but it was also like he left a legacy for in terms of his whole career. He did
Yeah,
a lot. So
I would agree. Sean Connery led a very full life.
mhm.
I mean, 90 when he passed away, so it's not a shock to anybody, but the timing and everything, I guess, with just a lot of emotions running high in the country. And I would, reflect also on Alex Trebek, who passed away, the day of recording of this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
hours
figures
ago.
important to our national consciousness that have kind of passed away here. Even Sean Connery being, obviously from the UK. But I just would like to respect his legacy, and he really did great as James Bond, of course. I mean,
Sure.
Definitely going to go down in history.
Oh yeah,
definitely is one of the most famous Scots, or in film, if not one of the most famous, just general actors out of that, the island of Britain. So
absolutely. Was there anything else you wanted to bring up, or
no? I mean, I just
we've
appreciate you having me on for this,
sure,
but I know you like Ebert reviews.
Yeah, dude, I love Roger.
And so Roger Ebert published 2 different criticisms of this film. One was published after he saw the New York premiere, and the other was published in 1997.
Okay.
And this film came out in 1968, so there was a significant gap of time in between those films. And what's cool about what Ebert really notes in that second interview is just the gargantuan impact this film had on modern cinema, which really just cannot be over or understated in any way. I mean, this film really just completely changed the direction of sci-fi as a genre, which at the time when Kubrick made it was really viewed as like a vessel for like cheap one-offs.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this film is so contemplative and cerebral, and it just really makes the viewer think. I think it's so cool. And so some cool quotes from the 97 interview with Ebert.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes in this, this is at length, it's quite a long,
Yeah.
The film did not provide the clear narrative and easy entertainment cues audiences expected. The closing sequences with the astronaut inexplicably finding himself in a bedroom somewhere beyond Jupiter were baffling. The overnight Hollywood judgment was that Kubrick had become derailed, that his obsession with effects and set pieces had failed to make a movie. The reflective part of it is, what he had actually done was make a philosophical statement about man's place in the universe, using images as those before him had used words, music, or prayer. And he made it a way that invited us to contemplate it, not to experience it vicariously as entertainment, which relates to what you said, as we might in a good, convenient science fiction film, but to stand outside it as a philosopher might and think about it. And that is the biggest, Yash, I'm speaking directly to you, aspect of the film that needs to be understood, is it really is not a film that was meant to be a wonderful cinematic, entertaining movie-going experience. And you get that, but it was very much meant to cut to the core of like your personal reflections on humanity as a species. And it's far more a philosophical piece than it is a cinematic piece.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of writers on this topic like really harken back to the Nietzschean roots of the idea. And so like the whole, you might have heard Nietzsche's got a saying that's quite famous, that God is dead. Have you heard that before?
I think I have.
Yeah. And it's very much a similar train of thought that Nietzsche had, that Kubrick had as well. The construct of God in our modern thinking is driven by religion, and that a deity exists beyond the bounds of space and time. But Kubrick was very of the mind that there's like 100 billion galaxies and potentialities for life and extraterrestrials life to exist. And so this film helps declare kind of that, in the same way that Nietzsche's work did, that God, for practical purposes, is dead, and that we as a society need to look to different things to explain reality. And 2001 does a lot of that work when representing the extraterrestrial entities that for humans would be perceived as quite godlike. Whatever beings must have left the monoliths. The film does a lot to kind of state that the definition between God and human is probably simply evolutionary and technological advancement related. So that someday some society, some alien civilization, or even humanity will reach a point technologically that their feats will be of that on the scale of gods viewed in for the ancient Greeks, who thought lightning hinged upon whatever Zeus thought.
Yeah.
We will see in a similar respect our current religious views, and that's not something you should talk on the podcast, but
it's a whole other topic.
It is, but I would like to just I putting that out there. There's a lot of like religious interpretive elements of this film that were very intentional on the part of Kubrick and very noteworthy when it comes to discussing like literary interpretations of the film, of which there are so many, like philosophical, really heady think pieces on this movie, number in the thousands. I wouldn't be the first person who's like cited this film in like undergrad dissertations.
Nice. Yeah, I mean there's a ton of things you can like watch and interpret in this movie if you really watch it with that lens. So I think that's very cool how it resonates with people in different ways.
Yeah. And it's certainly just such a it's just not palatable if you're just going in expecting entertaining,
if you expect like a run-of-the-mill sci-fi movie, you will probably be disappointed because it's not that at all.
Yeah. Between me and you, so what do you think sci-fi? What films really pioneer that genre and like matter in that genre?
That is a good question. That's tough to just answer right off the bat. Obviously, Star Wars had a huge impact on sci-fi, but sci-fi is such a broad genre. There are movies in sci-fi that have the element of realism, like 2001 and to some extent Interstellar. There's also the movies that are have like sci-fi elements. Like it could be a movie set in space, or it could just have like there's action sci-fi movies that have some element of like, I guess, I don't know, things that are not real, but they're inspired by like real concepts. But yeah, Star Wars.
I'm a sucker for a sci-fi film that's based in like some modicum of scientific reality. But what were you saying about Star Wars?
Star Wars is one. The first two Alien films are huge, I think, in terms of
They're huge.
And showing like a more of like a horror thriller type. They're so different too, but and I love both of them. But the first is more of like a quiet horror thriller that keeps the suspense going, whereas the second is just an all-out like action movie, which I love both of them. I think they kind of explore different possibilities of what science fiction can be.
I think another really important like discussion and conversations of sci-fi's development is the influence of Twilight Zone, the television series.
Yeah.
And what you had was really cool that was emergent in like the 50s and 60s was these like sci-fi either radio or television serials. And Arthur C. Clarke, who was involved in 2001: Space Odyssey, is very involved in the promulgation and development of sci-fi serial content. And so I think some of the boundary pushing that exists in 2001 somewhat credits itself to Twilight Zone and the way that Rod really pushed forth in telling really cool sci-fi narratives, which, like I said, the appetite for was really fantastical prior to these films. It was very much rooted in what crazy stories can we tell in space versus like what realistic stories can we tell about space.
Sure.
And if you ever had a discussion about television, Yash, I would talk at length about the Twilight Zone and its influence on the genre of sci-fi and thrillers.
Adam Grant, a nondescript kind of man found guilty of murder and sentenced to the electric chair. Like every other criminal caught in the wheels of justice, he's scared, right down to the marrow of his bones. But it isn't prison that scares him, the long, silent nights of waiting, the slow walk to the little room, or even death itself. It's something else that holds Adam Grant in the hot, sweaty grip of fear. Something worse than any punishment this world has to offer. Something found only in the Twilight Zone.
I have so many like thoughts, especially related to sci-fi films. I think Interstellar, almost to comment on it, does a better job at capturing curiosity than 2001 even does.
I mean, I like Interstellar a lot more than 2001.
I would argue, so Interstellar, if I were to genuinely divulge like a film I thought was more compelling than 2001 in this genre, it would be Interstellar.
Yeah.
I think 2001 matters a lot more.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Interstellar is an amazing movie. It's just so brilliant.
What's interesting about, and this kind of goes back to how the most ambitious movies sometimes require more than one viewing, because I saw Interstellar in the theater and I thought it was pretty good, but I watched it again over this quarantine and now I love it. Like it's completely changed. It's like just knowing
it's so brilliant.
Understanding the plot a little bit more added so much for me. In that movie.
I agree. It taps the Kubrickian mystery ambiguity thing a lot.
Yeah.
You know, when it comes to the mystery of these fourth dimensional, fifth dimensional, you know, beings in the library, you know, the book room, whatever.
Yeah.
But it also humanly, what it succeeds in where 2001 does not, is depicting human emotions. And Matthew McConaughey just drives that shit out of the park. When you see him reacting to the messages he's receiving when he was on the water planet, that dilated time very significantly for him, and he's receiving messages from his adult children. Yeah, and he's weeping. I'm also weeping with Matthew McConaughey in these sequences. It's a very human movie. It's visceral as hell. It really is very like human and quite frankly emotional. Yeah. And my very like the most pessimistic aspects of my nature, fear, are climate change, how you know our generation reacts to and affects climate change. And I unfortunately see this in this very Interstellar-esque scenario where our society is just plagued by these devastating meteorological shifts. Yeah. And Interstellar is marked by how that affects agriculture. And that's super realistic. Yeah, for sure. To get to you at the core of like what I think is a person, I think like some of the most important things that we can do as humans is figure out what the hell's going on in space. Yeah. And doing something, because like I said, I'm a firm believer we obviously made it to the moon. Yeah, for sure. With gosh, I wish I knew his name. The professor at A&M. He's Argentinian. He's like, he would always bring in like at exam days, he'd bring in like Tootsie Rolls and stuff. But he's this Argentinian professor at A&M, astronomy professor, that really like fostered this idea of you know, adventures out. There's so much out there in me. Yeah. I think movies like 2001, Interstellar, they make the viewer more curious about what might be out there in space, you know, without ever like being 100% clear, because there's some sequences in Interstellar that I don't fully comprehend, but I'm able to like follow that movie a little bit more just because. Okay, what do you think is incomprehensible? Immediately me assuming that like the book room sequence is pretty incomprehensible. Interstellar, yeah, I mean like everything that happens pretty much in the third act. Yeah. Like I'm able to follow it to some extent, but also it's I'm not like, I don't think I have a perfect understanding of it, which is fine. Here's my 6 hours of college astronomy talking, which albeit is not a lot. Humans do a very like poor job of understanding time, because we view it very much as a linear, this hour is this hour that, this hour that. You know, daylight savings time is hinged upon times and time zones, but when it comes to physical reality that's been expressed in our astronomical discoveries, time is not a linear concept. It's, a matter of fact, a very fluid, very physical concept that is dependent upon gravitational forces. Time is not linear in the way we perceive it, but very dependent upon the gravitational effects of celestial bodies. And recently we've seen a lot of cool discoveries with gravitational waves that have hinted far more in the favor of this idea that time is not as we perceive it, and rather a very fluid concept dependent upon other essential forces that dictate physics. Strong nuclear, weak nuclear, gravitational, electromagnetics as the four fundamental forces of physics. Films like Interstellar and 2001 explore the depths of what if we don't properly understand time as a dimension,
Right.
which is very, very rooted in actual physics. Scott Kelly, they're American astronauts. Mark Kelly recently was just elected to Senate. He was not on Earth as long as his brother Scott Kelly. They were twins, identical twins, and NASA ran this experiment to test the genome sequences of these people. And Mark Kelly and Scott Kelly diverge by their DNA because one of them was in space far longer than their brother. And it's just super interesting to see. GPSs calculate for it, like the actual satellites that surround the Earth are built upon the assumption that like 0.00006.1251% of their calculations are going to be off mathematically. So time is warped by gravity. That has broad sweeping implications to how we interpret films like Interstellar.
Okay, so before we wrap up today, I wanted to ask you, and you kind of brought this up earlier, but if you had to convince someone to watch this movie, what would you tell them, or what's like your sales pitch for the movie? And I'll share mine after you do that.
I've got kind of a little thing on this. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, picture yourself, it's 1968, and you know NASA is on the verge of, in the next year, 1969, going to land on the moon. And through Stanley Kubrick's perfectionism and the way he depicts space travel, he really captures the human curiosity. And 2001: A Space Odyssey is not a film you're going to go into expecting, clear plot points, but it is a film I can promise you you'll go into expecting an artistic masterpiece that is a comment on human civilization. And if you can step back for a moment when looking at the film and less look of it as a film and more look of it as a philosophical statement that humanity is guided by technology, and there's going to come a time in the future where we're going to reckon with where we're headed as a civilization. And I would say a lot of hit signs point to the fact that we're headed to space. And so if you care about humanity's development and really what cuts to the core of our being, which is awe and wonder and beauty and majesty with nature and the universe, things that really drive us at a very low, existential evolutionary level, 2001 is a film that really speaks to our human curiosity and the things that really drive us forward as a species. And so it's just a very cool film that is visually brilliant. It depicts space excellently. It's probably one of the most accurate films when it comes to depicting space. And I would argue that anybody should see this film that cares about human society and has ever had the thought, like, what else is out there? Anybody that's had the thought, what is beyond our Earth? What is, just peeking past the horizon? This is a film that inspires magnificence and curiosity and beauty when you look at it, because it's very intentionally designed to. And Kubrick really, I think, hit it out of the ballpark when it comes to making people look at this film and ask questions, which is really the point. Ask questions about who we are as a species and where we are going. And if you care at all about humanity, this is a film I think that's really important for you to view.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say something probably similar to what you have said, how it's more of an experience than a movie. It's definitely not a movie I would recommend to my mainstream movie watching friends. I think if you love cinema, you should check it out for sure, because it's like one of those movies you have to watch if you're a true cinema fan, because you have to see where you stand on it because it's so divisive. And it's such an interesting movie that challenges you to think, and also is a great showcase of just amazing visual effects.
Yeah. I think this film is such an important entry to the canon of American film and Western film writ large. It makes a lot of clear statements. It's very bold. It is not necessarily digestible to, like you said, your mainstream viewer, but it is nonetheless a critical entry into film canon. And I think if you're a person that's interested in film, this is something you really need to dive into, because it is very integral to the development of film, and like any Stanley Kubrick film is.
Right. It's a big part of what science fiction is today.
Yeah, I mean, it is such an influence. I wish, when looking at Star Wars films and whatnot, one of the things that they did not take away from this film was how to properly portray like a vacuum in space. Because you see so many, explosions and like laser noises and all of these things that would behave far differently in the true vacuum of space. But certainly it has inspired the scale of modern film immensely. And every film that takes place in space is learning from this movie.
For sure.
Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
All right. So with that, we wrap up our discussion on 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'd like to thank Tim for joining us today. From all of us at Cinema Convos, we thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in next time.